Thank you for having me. One thing I hate to do is I hate to talk about my work. I don't know, I felt like I made my work so I didn't have to talk about my work. That's one thing. Let me get past these. All right, I'll start here. Well, just to tell you a little bit about me, you mentioned a lot about me in terms of my background. I went to school at Atlanta College of Art and I studied sculpture. No, actually I went to art school with the intention. I had this teacher in high school and he wanted me. He said, no, there's no reason for you to go and study sculpture and paint. He said, go into design. I went into, the first class. I think I said no. I went to a lecture and there was this Cuban artist named Luis Cruz Azaceta. And he was talking about his days in New York and he just looked like he was having so much fun in the 80s, and he was talking about his work and he was doing his thing, and I changed my major immediately. These are photographs that were given to me, and I usually use these first because it was one of the first influences with my work, was that my grandmother gave me about 400 photographs before she died. And she hadn't been to my studio. She lived in Virginia, and I just remember her giving me the photographs, and from then on, when she gave me those images, my goal was to make work that communicated with those that were the closest to me. And so with these photographs, for a long time I used these photographs, close to 400, but a lot of them were like unknown family members. So I choose to use the ones that I didn't know anything about, because I felt like those photographs would become discarded. And I use those photographs almost like the same attitude as that when you come and you approach African art for the first time in a museum and you don't know the history about it, but you feel the soul of it and you feel the energy from it. So I was really reading the energy from the photographs. And I'm jumping around. And some of these photographs, I have a lot of photographs that are in here. I want to run through them real quick and I'll speak about them as fast as I can and keep going and keep going and keep going. So this was like a recent painting that I did, and it was commissioned by Atlanta Falcons. I'm sorry they're not winning, but yeah, the Atlanta Falcons. It was commissioned for their new stadium. And the stadium was located real close to Atlanta University. Atlanta University was all the HBCUs. Morehouse, Spelman, Clark, Morris Brown, all the schools existed. And so what I did was I created a painting. If you were to look outside the window of the stadium on the left side, you would actually see the campus of Atlanta University. So I wanted to do a piece that was based around that. I wanted to deal with the subject of football, but it was more than just a game. So in dealing with the subject, I used images from HBCUs from 1920 to like 1908, 1911. And some of them are just different. This is me working in the studio with it. I'm jumping around, moving quick though. I'll keep going. This piece is called Precession, and I think earlier you mentioned something about, I talked about like, there was a thing about my work. I wanted to figure out a way to make work that could heal. So I decided, another thing too, I never knew when a work was finished, so I told myself to stop on the 7th layer no matter what. So if the truck, when the truck came, sometimes the paintings were wet. So I started making these paintings that are inside of cabinets, and I deal with cabinets where it's like whenever you get sick, you go to a medicine cabinet and get medicine. And for me, it was like memory as a form of medicine. The one on the right is called Uprooted, and it was based around the floods that happened in Houston, Texas. I remember it was a real bad flood, and I had an opening during this flood, and the flood itself shut down my opening. So they invited me back, and they put me upstairs because I was doing work that was based around water, and so that's called Uprooted. It's my studio, kind of how I work on several things at one time. And these are like some of the works with the photographs. I'm kind of going back and forth in time-wise with images. See, I used to paint on doors, and these are doors that were taken from the Third Ward and Fourth Ward in Houston, Texas, and based on blues musicians. And this one in general was based around Jimi Hendrix and putting a guitar on fire. So I kind of put a guitar on fire inside of a door. It's a painting I did for the airport in Atlanta, and it was done. And the reason why I show this sometimes is because I had 2 months to make the painting, and the painting had to be up right before the Olympics, and it was kind of like this crazy time period. It's a piece based on my mother. My mother's a school teacher. I took like old piano tops and created like almost like a map in a way. The white parts are thimbles and dealing with constellations, but then also dealing with quilt making. And it also has a metronome on it, so it clicks. Sounds like an old grandfather's clock, and it's based on my mother. This is called Denmark Vesey meets Shango. This is painted with rum, tobacco, and railroad tracks, crossroads, tracing different things, different practices amongst the Yoruba people. Dealing with different deities, like one in particular named Eshu, and dealing with crossroads. And some of the materials that are used, like, there's the tobacco, and those are axes that are used to cut the tobacco, but also did a play between the axe that's on the side of the glass, which looks like one particular deity named Shango, and it's really the reflection of the glass on top of the piece, the mirror image. And this is like an installation. When I was in school, I studied sculpture, but the thing about working in sculpture is very complicated because you have to use a lot of materials and steel and storage and making things. So basically, I started painting because it was very complicated to get set up. Which forced me into a situation of doing installations and working in different ways. So this is like a piece that was from installation. Some of these are like sculptures that are dealing with those who escaped from slavery and got caught, which would the slave owners would actually put almost like these collars around them, so that they could hear them if they were escaping. They had bells on them, and just try to make it more difficult for one to escape. And so I started really playing with these blacksmiths and working and playing with there's a well-known metal blacksmith named Philip Simmons in Charleston, South Carolina, who was very much influenced by some of the gate work and metal work he did. These are some of the same. And this one is more like dealing with Eshu too, and using these symbols of top hats, and they're kind of reoccurring throughout my work, and also the use of like railroad tracks. And these are some too. This is like a big tarp. It's probably about 20 feet by 15 feet, and it's all kind of painted with Georgia clay and using shipping tarps and boulders. And this is a piece that's done with a boulder and rock on top of a black canvas. It's called Rockin', and it was just based around, I don't know, Bob Marley, Michael Jackson, dancing, playing. So this is like some of the early installations where I use sound. I use the sounds of oceans, and on the walls kind of painted like this mint green, which was one of my grandfather's favorite color green. And it's reminiscent of my grandfather, but using the photographs from my family. And so on the wall itself, in white, which you can't see, it has different bodies of water all around the world, in different parts, in different places in space. From the Mississippi to Niger, and then there's different places in outer space. And as you hear the sounds of the ocean, you walk around, you start to hear the sounds of trains. And some of the trains were just dealing with the migration between north to south, and my father being a railroad engineer, and also my family being a part of the Underground Railroad, one of the reasons why my family ended up in New Jersey. And so as you keep walking around, you start to smell tobacco as you hear the sounds, and you smell the tobacco, which is on the back of the wall, but then also you hear insects on a full moon. And so what photograph you saw earlier, this is part of the installation, and this is more so like I was invited back in 98, 99 to come back to the school, which I graduated, and do an installation. And it was really me breaking away from doing the typical paintings, and I started to get back into making sculptural things. And that's a field where my grandfather picked tobacco, so I kind of incorporated a lot of stuff like that. I'm gonna move on a little bit faster. This is also on my father's side. My father's side, they were Garveyites, and so I was making reference to my father's side being Garveyites, but then also making references some of our family members that fought in the different wars, and also on the back of that. So it's a combination of all these thoughts at one time. And when I think about Marcus Garvey talking about going back to Africa, I think more so like what we think about it today. It's really about me understanding my background and who I am. And so basically I have my DNA on the throughout the painting itself. And as soon as I found out my DNA, I made this painting. Some of them have no names. I'm just responding. This one's called Minor Keys, and it's based around my favorite jazz musician, which is Sun Ra. Sun Ra talked about outer space, talked about he was from Saturn, but the truth of the matter is Sun Ra was from Birmingham, Alabama. But he said he was from Saturn. I still believe that he's from Saturn. So inside the piano itself, it's gutted out in glass, and over top the top part, there's like a blue tint that goes across it. It's hard to read in the photograph, but the blue itself looks almost like the ocean, and I like to compare space and ocean, the two, how we sit somewhere at a crossroads between the two. This was a piece I was asked to make, and it was based around the Black Panthers, and the show was called The Whole World is Rotten, and I was doing a piece based around the Black Panthers, but also like dealing with the breakfast program that they created and feeding people. So it's a mixture of stuff. This is called Bluebird from the Seventh Sphere, based around Charlie Parker. This is like 93. This is an exercise that I do every once in a while. It's like whenever I go somewhere, sometimes I want to make a piece within like a couple hours. So basically, there's a radio on the left-hand side, and the radio itself is playing Charlie Parker's music. On the right-hand side, there's an African finch, and the African finch would jump around and chirp. And then up under on the sheet, down below, there's sheet music down below. And so what the bird would do is poop on top of the sheet music, and they created these almost paintings that looked like Jackson Pollock paintings. And the piece is called, but the piece is called Bird Shit. So this is a piece that, I don't know, this was loosely, there's an architect a builder who built my house and studio, and I promised to give him a piece for building my house. And so this was a piece that I gave him, and it was based around architecture in Louisiana. And there's a place called an Afric House that's in a part of Louisiana, which has this high-pitched roof. And I made this piece because I was making it for the builder, but I also was making it for my children. And it was like, thinking about, my daughter wanted a dollhouse. I said, no, I got your dollhouse. So that's what this piece is called, Cascade. My first passion was to play baseball. Before I went to art school, I wanted to play baseball. So I created this fictional league, and the league was called the Liberators. And so it's called Liberators, but these are made on military blankets. And the idea of war, baseball, kind of still the same play of like earlier, even more recent stuff. And that's a bat, and the bat's about maybe 10 feet tall, and that's called cleanup. And my favorite, the position that I played when I played baseball, I was a catcher, so that's a baseball jersey with Georgia clay, taken from the Little League baseball field where I grew up playing, and it's meant to be more like a hunter's jacket, like within West Africa, terms that has amulets and different things wrapped with on the jacket when they go out hunting, and it's also supposed to protect them. So it's spirit catcher. It's another bat. This is after I did my DNA and traced my family side to Sierra Leone and Guinea, amongst the Baga and Mende. And so I started doing work about that. And so with that piece itself, I just made a little collage of like these boys recovering African art throughout the water. This is like a DNA strand I made. And these are paintings. I don't really say much about it. My favorite piece is that there's a boat in the background that's right here. And the boat's like a speedboat, and in the back of the speedboat, it has where the propellers turns into a DNA strand. And this one's called Black Redemption, based around Marcus Garvey's boats, but I also had incorporated, at the same time I was making this show and did my DNA, my cousin was making this, he was rebuilding this Cadillac. And this Cadillac he was rebuilding, and what I did was, I did video footage of me in Senegal, but I was in a fishing boat. And while I was in the fishing boat, what I wanted to do was videotape myself going to the door, no return, and coming back. And so within the car itself, with its beautiful sound system and projector, TVs that are in the back, they're actually playing that. And this was parked on top of the campus of Clark Atlanta University when I had the show at the gallery with those images with my boat. Oh yeah, that's a speedboat. And this is a piece I did based on Door No Return. This was all one show, and I was in two different venues. One of them I actually recreated the door itself and I took the measurements and I created a wall within the gallery, and on top of it is a projector. And I took a friend of mine who, she did her DNA, and her name's Fatima Robinson. I went with her, and I went with a guy named Mark Anthony Thompson. Fatima is a choreographer, and she did a lot of she actually did a Michael Jackson video where she taught the dancers how to dance. And her being a dancer took her, and then I took a musician with me named Mark Anthony Thompson, and he just he goes by the name of Chocolate Genius, but he does this kind of crazy music stuff. And we had similar DNA, so we went at the same time. And that's Fatima when she responded to meeting some of the dancers in Senegal. And so there's this piece that's projected on the back, which is projected on a screen, and then when she spins around, she turns into smoke. I always wanted to create a tintype, so this is like my version of a tintype. These are photographs that are printed on steel, and they rust, but they don't rust where the images are printed. This is a lantern I've been working on for a while. It's in a show right now, but it's different than what it is now. On the inside, there's a neon N on the inside of it, dealing with North. And it was about my father. And this is another one dealing with, I had some images of family members who fought in the Civil War. And this was a big lantern. It's probably about 5 feet. This piece called Ghost. And Ghost is a photograph. I made this piece with an iPhone. And I took a picture of a negative of a photograph, pointed out in the back of my yard, on the back of my window. And I live on Civil War grounds. And so it's kind of play between, you can kind of, if you look at it in some ways, you can kind of see the woods, but you can also see the negative. So it was just a play. This is called Storm at Sea. It's a piece made with piano keys turning into waves. And I always felt like the first form of DNA for me was music. And I felt like responding to rhythms was similar, like trying to understand your DNA. And the idea was, what if there was this storm at sea that was caused by this African deity that was meant to cause thunder and lightning, which is Shango. These are little small paintings I do on sheet music. And this is, I like to make beautiful, bright, colored paintings with very difficult subjects. So this is Elmina off the coast of Ghana, and a slave castle, but it was also using classical music and painting over top of it, kind of creating my own soundtrack, almost like jazz in a way. And these are some similar. This is a drawing, I call it Western Currents, and it was just like a boat of all like different parts of West Africa and African art. And this is the painting for it. This is probably about 12 feet by 10 feet. And it was meant to show different kinds of weather at the same time. So there's a storm, but the sun's coming out. It's rough, and then it's calm in a way. This is a music stand I created. I don't know, it was a response to my reaction to spending time in New Orleans. So all the instruments are from New Orleans. And I forgot I'm trying to remember the title of the piece. But you can kind of see. But it's about 11 feet tall. This is this is a mixture of work. This one in particular is called World Cup. And so what I have, back during the World Cup when it was in South Africa, is really more so observation of me hearing different things or watching TV. And I remember they were playing these little horns on, what were they called? Zouzophones or Zuzu or something, but they sound just like bees. And so basically what's happening is I have speakers built inside of that nest, bees, in that hive. And so you hear the sounds of bees buzzing. This is a painting from west to east, from east to west, from south to north. This is called Cerebral Caverns. That face usually reoccurred in the bust, and it's from a death mask from the Congo. And so I kind of reuse it a lot in a lot of different ways. There's a piece based around Sun Ra. That's the piano and spins around. And let me see, and this piece is called Windward Coast. And this is, I use that same bust, but it was based around those that were lost at sea, but then also like some of the things in terms of the ocean and being out in the ocean can feel so massive. And I remember as a kid going fishing with my father and going so far out where we couldn't see land and feeling so small. And so it's a calming piece, but it's also a very difficult piece. It's probably over 400 sets of piano keys. And you're also there's a conch shell in the very corner. I remember seeing this conch shell when I went off the coast of Georgia and I went to Cumberland Island. There was a plantation on the island. I remember seeing on this plantation, and people weren't allowed to go onto it because the property owners, it was private. And what I remember seeing were these chimneys stacked. And all I could see was like chimneys, and those were where the Africans lived. But I remember this one chimney, there was this conch shell right in the middle, right above the fireplace. And it just, for me, it felt like that was like a spiritual gesture that just said something. So I started using the conch shell in different ways. So the conch shell itself has the sounds of me installing the piano keys on the installation, ripping open the box, sounds almost like waves ripping, and at the same time I'm listening to Coltrane. So that's it's kind of like a close-up with the bust. This is based on Pullman, pulmonary, blues, mixture of music and blood. These are some of the same things that were made around the same time. Once I realized, like there's a reference to a Mende form, which is a sculpture on the right that I spin on a lathe. And I took the form, but then also within this room, I made my smallest piece, which was a drawing of right here on sheet music inside of one of the old tintype photographs from my grandmother, and it was just really making a reference to that. But then in the background where that sculpture was sitting, you can kind of see this form right here. That's the actual sculpture, but then this is the actual sculpture in the collection that I'm referencing. So it's like the mirror reflections on the glass. That's tricky. And this one's called Levitate, and it's really a boat that's kind of floating in front of the piece. And this is one that I was working on, off and on working on it. Oh, sideways. I've been sewing these different regiments of regiments from the Civil War, African American troops. Sideways. I'm gonna try to move on because I don't like looking at my older work. This is called Echo. It's based around the Great Mosque in Mali. And it's like the Georgia clay and kind of drips into conch shell. But it's made out of steel and printed on steel. These are other ones. This is called Ness. I don't know why. And these are based on the voice and double consciousness. So it's like a mirror on this side, almost like a mirror. I don't know, some of these objects and things that I collect, like what I was really fascinated with this piece was it's a piano top, and I gold leafed it. Part of it is the reason why I gold leafed it came from a high school, and a lot of kids when they in school, I remember it came from a school that I was supposed to go to, and I remember kids would often when it came to like music class, it became more like recess. It became a whole different thing. So every kid almost carved their name on top of the piece, and so they put their own patina in it, so I just gold leafed it. I know some of these are shown. This one's called Lost and Found. That's my old family photo album. Some of it's like, and then on the top I remember, what do you call it, the 14-year, 17-year cicada, the locust. I remember being caught in one of those storms and seeing all these bugs flying around when I visit my grandparents. So it's really like kind of going back to the memories of that. And on the hand, it's like an image of Saturn. I know how we doing with time. I'm getting close. I'm moving. Some of these I won't speak much about. This is called On Your Way Up. It's just dealing with crocodiles. All right, let me go. Sometimes I work in glass sometimes. And that's a vase with glass ore on the inside, and it's kind of foggy at the bottom. Well, this is a piece, I don't have a title, I think it's called Blue Black. And it was based around like a Mary Baraka poem. And it just drips indigo. Oh, it's all about the North Pole. So this was like a recent show. I did a big tarp and with tracks on top. And on top of that, there's like the north, there's a neon N on the top of it. It's about maybe 20 feet by 20 feet. It's a piece based around the shooting in Charleston, South Carolina. So the blood kind of travels with the tracks and the palmetto. All right, I'm getting close to being finished. This is based around my father-in-law, who I didn't know, who I was always a fan of, which is Gordon Parks. And so I was commissioned by the Gordon Parks Foundation to make a piece on him. And this was like from one of his photographs. Him and he was doing, with Ellison, they were doing a piece based on the Invisible Man. And so one of these, this was a part of one of the images that was made for a book with them. And so it's kind of like you can kind of walk inside of it. And on the outside, there's like, I used his photograph and kind of cut it out. And so the lights, it's kind of like a 3D piece. These are little sculptures I make every once in a while where I use conductor hats with African art. I'm getting close. I don't want to talk about much. This is a piece I made a couple years ago for Prospect in New Orleans. And I created this piece, it's called Vessel. And I have the sounds of trains, a friend of mine playing the cello on a full moon, and you hear the sounds, and there's a fire burning, there's a crack, and there's a stereo system built on the inside of it. And it was placed on the Mississippi, right between the railroad tracks and a park in New Orleans. And this is a recent piece. I was invited to do a piece for the Istanbul Biennale, and I made a piece that was based around the Clotilda, which was a slave ship that was found in the Mobile Bay. I was dealing with the histories of that, but I also wanted to create somewhat of a vessel where someone could be transported, but references to slavery, but references beyond slavery. But on the background, there's a radio, and when you hear the radio itself, the radio is playing, you can kind of see it with a pyramid antenna, but the radio is playing Sun Ra, but June Tyson's singing, and basically when she's singing, she sings like when you find Earth boring, just the same old same thing, sign up for Outer Spaceways Incorporated. And it plays that, but then also plays the sounds from Senegalese fishermen working on boats. While they're working on boats and the ocean's crashing, you hear them talking back and forth. And then I invited a friend of mine named Taurus Mantine, who's a bass player, and he plays in the background of it too. So I kind of composed this kind of piece in a strange way. But yeah. And yes, and this piece, Pensive. Pensive was commissioned, The piece was first commissioned by Amherst, and it was a show that was being put on by about Du Bois, and there was maybe about 15 of us that were being commissioned to do pieces. And, you know, after knowing and reading and living in Atlanta and knowing the history of Du Bois from different angles, he was such a serious dude. I only know how to deal with serious stuff sometimes. It's through humor. And so there's a reference to Rodin. And so I'm kind of playing back and forth with that and having a conversation while, you know, still digging and searching for information about Du Bois. I have other stuff. I had the intent on doing this piece, and at the time I was being considered to do an installation at the Royal Museum in Central Africa, which is in Belgium. The Royal Museum of Central Africa is in Belgium, and there's a pool and there's a fountain that's right in front of the museum, and there was talk about Du Bois and spending time at the museum, and I was really trying to do research and figure out those connections and know more about the actual event that happened there. And so this piece was more so a piece that I was thinking in my brain that this was going to be out in front of the Royal Museum of Central Africa towards the fountain. So, yeah. Pensize. Thank you. I guess I'll take some questions. I don't know. It's so hard to talk about my work. Is this?
Yeah, okay, can we move the, like right here, so if you don't mind, you can actually come up and ask your question. We'll see if we can have a
or can we just pass around the microphone?
we'll never get it back.
Okay.
There you go. So if you don't mind, you can actually come up.
I think I can talk loudly. So I noticed like you went past some of your slides, and I noticed there was the Gammon statue by Augustus Savage.
The what now, statue?
Gammon, that bust by Augustus Savage.
Uh-huh.
We were talking about the train and the water and jazz, and so I'm like wondering, is the Harlem Renaissance with Du Bois, is that one of your favorite time periods to explore?
Yeah, well, that's one out of many. I think the Black Arts movement and
Yeah, some of the water stuff reminded me of some of the Romeo Bearden's paintings.
right.
Yes.
Yeah, the first two artists I met when I was a kid was Jacob Lawrence and James Vandersea. And sometimes I think because of the use of the narrative with Jacob Lawrence and the use of color, and then also the use of photography in such a way, I feel like I've always kind of like combined almost every single one of those artists that I've actually kind of encountered. But I've always been influenced by like a lot of different movements. You know, I like the movements that like a movement between James Brown and Fela. I like the movements between Ali Fakatore and the blues musicians. And so I like a lot of different movements. I mean, I've always been influenced by like filmmakers like Ousmane Siembre from Senegal, and you know, there's a lot. And then, you know, it's also like I feel like I'm that kid of hip hop. You know, I grew up, you know, knowing and looking at rap music and seeing it in hip hop in a certain way, and ways in which things are put together and collaged to recreate. And I think about, jazz and music and all of it in the same, a certain kind of, where music becomes like the fuel for a lot of us visual artists. We don't necessarily see them as separate. We see them all within in the same way. So yeah, yes. Man, why you got?
I was recently in Georgia. But I was really taken with the color of dirt.
Mm-hmm.
And using Georgia, you call it clay. I
Yeah.
don't know a whole lot about it.
Yeah.
What is it about that? The dirt there. I mean, it's like bright orange, red, brown.
Yeah. Georgia clay, it's a strange thing. I remember my first encounters with Georgia clay was probably playing baseball. And then I think later on, I remember hearing stories about Georgia clay. Some people would talk about they use it and they eat it and they drink it. Some people, you hear the history of talk about those that lost lives and blood in the earth. Then there's a talk about Native Americans in terms of the clay itself. And I've always been fascinated. And then when I look at the earth, images that I've seen and of like Mali and seeing similar like colors. So for me, that's some of my personal references, but I'm still fascinated. I think it's still like a lot to learn about it. But I don't know, I think sometimes I'm actually using things because I don't know much about it and I want to learn more about it, so I play with it until I get the answers. So you may have come in here and told me something that I didn't know, and that would have been perfect, and I would have carried on to the next lecture. You mean, when you say archival, what do you mean?
Well, how long would it last?
Oh, yeah. Well, I would hope it lasts a long time, but it's also, I think work changes no matter what. I had a friend I went to school with, and he made these paintings that always were moving. No matter what, they just moved. And I thought that was beautiful, but it's also not necessarily practical. But I've always tested limits. I've always used materials that were not non-traditional. And I actually love working with things that are non-traditional materials because I just get more out of it. But I haven't had any real problems yet. So.
I have several questions. My name is Dale, and I'm a photographer. And I was fascinated by all the photographs that your relative included in.
Mm-hmm.
What is your intentions eventually with the 400 photographs that you received? Because they were really fascinating.
You said what were my intentions?
Yes.
I think it was more than anything, it was really like, how can I hold on to this and share it with people? It's strange because you look at these photographs and you see a lot of these people and they're dressed up and they're, in a certain way. And, there's an assumption sometimes like with a lot of my images that because I live in Atlanta, that they may be from Georgia or from the South, but a lot of photographs are from the North. My intentions, I don't know, I think it's just to preserve. I mean, just to kind of honor my grandmother for making that, sharing that with me at that time. But I don't know if I answer your question, but.
Yeah, you're a New York gallerist, Jack Shainman,
Yeah.
has a bunch of very interesting artists that he shows all of your work. And I know that there have been some collaborative shows that involve your work, but how much interaction do you have with some of the interesting people that show at his gallery? I'm thinking of Michael and
Yeah.
Dave and those guys.
Yeah, we see each other every once in a while, have conversations, and we talk shop. And we used to be very close with Barclay Hendricks before he passed. And, you know, it's nice to be able to have friends, I mean, that are artists. We love each other, but we can't deal with each other for so long. We could deal, I mean, we love each other, but we have our own. So it's beautiful. I mean, I think it's being in a gallery like Jack. I've been with Jack since like 98, and it's been a good relationship. And you know, in terms of like the artists of color that are in the gallery, it's a mix from all different parts of the world, which is a beautiful thing. I don't know. It's a nice mix. I don't.
So you mentioned a couple of times that you did your DNA, and I wonder if you could say a little more about what that meant, what it affirmed, what it unlocked. It seems like it has informed your art practice in some way.
It did. I think what it was just being an African American artist and growing up in the States and not necessarily knowing. You have a sense that you're from West Africa DNA, but you don't know exactly where. So, you know, often, you know, there are these shows that come around throughout the country which deal with different, you know, different types of work from different places of West Africa that relate to our DNA before we even knew. And so often I would go and I was doing my research and I was searching. I had a problem to solve, and I would just go to museums, galleries, figure it out. But eventually, when this tool came around that you can test your DNA, it opened up a lot, and but it answered some questions, but some things I pretty much already knew. So in many ways, it was a good thing. And I needed it at that time, but it's also once I figured it out, it put me at ease in a different way, where I could share that with not just myself and not with just people viewing my work, but with my mother, my father, my brother, you know. And so that was the part for me that was good. And then I took my brother with me to Senegal. And my brother's into finance. So he got more out of the trip than I did. And I just remember him sitting at a bar, him having this conversation with this cat from Senegal, and they're talking about money back and forth, and they're just, and they're arguing and they're laughing, and then, you know, here, you know, if you want to go and get something, you got to barter. And my brother's the best barter. So that was just like a beautiful experience. So I remember those kind of experiences. But yeah, I think it's, and when I did the trip, I did it with a festival called the National Black Arts Festival in Atlanta. And so they, as a part of doing it, we did one whole middle school. Middle school in Atlanta's DNA. All the kids had their DNA done. So, which was like, so.
What was your introduction to Orisha, and how have they
what was my introduction? It's kind of private, but kind of, let's just say this. I was a part of someone who I helped have someone made, and I was a participant within it, but at the same time, I was not allowed to be in because they felt like I knew too much, and they didn't want to interrupt my freedom to do what I want to do the way I want to do it. And so, yeah, and it was by way of Cuba, by way of San Francisco, Oakland. Yeah, and yeah, so that was kind of like my connection.
All right, so we're going to put our hands together and thank Radcliffe Bailey.